This past summer or early fall, my husband and I took council member, the has-been council member, which I am too, Steve Peterson and his fiancee to dinner, and I asked if he would like to talk about his years on council. He's been on council for 14 years, decided not to run for re-election this past fall, as did two others of us. But he was part of the Planning Commission before he was elected for city council. He was representing District 1 and did it very well. He served on various national boards and committees, including leading telecommunications, and I will let him tell you all that. Elected 4 times to the council, and probably was in line to become the mayor at some point in time, but Mayor Winstead has been doing such a fine job that he's still there. He is going to continue, Steve is going to continue on the Charter Commission in Bloomington. He works for Microsoft Corporation. His focus is on the design and improvement group. He spoke to us 2-3 years ago on robotics, and that's one of his passions at this point. He's been involved with the Kennedy High School robotics team and has done very well. I don't use the word clone very easily, but this is a guy, if cloning was ever recommended and approved, this is one man that should be cloned. He, by far, has been the most valuable person on council for the last many years. He has insight. He looks backwards, looks forwards, and puts into words very, very well what he thinks should be done, and we listen very carefully. Without any further ado, and Steve has known me since he was maybe 8 or 10. We belong to the same church. We used to. I know his parents very well, and he was the one that recommended that I run for council, and I thought, what the heck is he talking about? There he is. Thanks, Steve.
Well, Karen, if you come up here, we're going to start with a Twitter lesson for you on the computer. So, well, thank you for those kind words. Again, my name is Steve Peterson, and I, just to recap a little bit more, as I was on the Planning Commission before I was on the City Council. I started in 1996. So I've been involved at the city in various things for almost 20 years. And for city employees who've been around for a while, prior to being on the Planning Commission, I entered and won a art reuse contest at the city for, they were pulling it, remember how they used to have those kind of rocking, on playgrounds, they'd have like a rocking chicken or bird and stuff like that. And they figured out that when a kid got hit in the head with that, you know, it was like being in football these days. And so the city decided that they were going to take those out, and they wanted a reuse proposal. And at that time, I was working with somebody who was an artist, and I said, they're looking for reuse proposals. And so I actually, I think it's my proudest moment at the city is I think I got $100 from the city for winning this reuse contest, but it somehow never got implemented. In terms of the reuse of these things. They're probably in some big warehouse like the end of that Orson Welles movie where they're looking for the sled. You know, it's probably in some city warehouse like that and not able to be found. But thanks for inviting me to come today, and I'm going to put the phone out here so I can actually see how much time I have. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today, and this is an unusual thing for me because I don't often get invited to give talks with a completely kind of open-ended topic on it. And so it's much easier for me to give a talk where it has a very kind of narrow focus and I'm talking about a particular subject. And so I had to go through and kind of take, you know, the universe and boil it down to things that I wanted to talk about. And I decided to divide my talk into 2 parts. Basically it's the past and present of Bloomington on one hand, and on the future and some key challenges that the city faces in the future. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about past and present. And the first thing I want to talk about is why I think Bloomington is what it is today. Because if you take the central city and you follow the second tier and first tier suburbs, and we're kind of a blend between a second tier and a first tier suburb, age-wise, around the metro area, there's widely varying levels of success in different suburbs. And you have to ask why is it different here than in suburbs in other parts of the metro area? And Larry Lee will probably agree with some of the things I have to say and disagree with some of the things I have to say, but one of the first things that yeah, if you see me ducking, that's because Larry's disagreeing with what I'm saying. But one of the first things you have to realize, and this is a pattern that happens in very many cities, is that starting in the very earliest part of the development pattern of the city, the good part of the city expands radially from the center. Okay, so one reason, and this is one reason that I think Bloomington did well, is that part of Bloomington is influenced by the Lowry Hill kind of part of Minneapolis expanding to Edina and that way. If you look at that development pattern going out, that happens that way. And part of it is the working class neighborhoods that went through South Minneapolis and through Richfield. So many big cities have this pattern where people live in the suburb and they want to get a little bit bigger house, and they move, you draw a line from downtown through their house, and that's where they move to, is someplace a little bit farther out. So one of the benefits that we had was our suburb was in the right spot. So that's not something you can much influence, but one thing you could influence is that you did have early leaders that made good planning decisions about the city. And so one thing you have to realize in Minnesota is that you don't want a city that's all residential in Minnesota. A city that's all residential is a city that has an unbalanced tax base in the city. And so our city leaders made decisions about setting land aside. And if you look at the comprehensive plan map, you can see that there's one corridor that kind of runs down Lyndale, and then across 94th Street over to Penn Avenue, and then there's another area out at Nesbitt on Old Shakopee Road that are kind of our industrial areas. But we also did a very good job of developing an office market, primarily along 494. And those things happened in part because we had good leadership and in part because of our location. And so if you compare us to other cities and the sorts of development that they have along the freeway, you can see that there's some of both of that going on. Another thing that I think people don't realize about our city that as the metro area has grown, that turns out to be a huge benefit for our city, is the location of the river on the south side of our city. And what that does is that drives up transportation time for people on the other side of the river. And it makes it so that people say, I want to live in Bloomington because I don't have to sit in that traffic for a half hour every day going back and forth to the other side of the river. Now, there's some people who want to go and live in the new house and be in a community where it's in the growing community. There's, and there's lots of benefits, like, for example, with kids and stuff like that there'll be lots of kids around. But if you value being at home with your family while they're growing up, people tend to live on this side of the river. And you can see that in the value of housing in our community. And so there's a underappreciated benefit to our city of being in the location that we're on. It makes it a desirable place for people to live, particularly for people who want to make that time versus cost trade-off. Another thing and this is a decision that was partially a free market decision and partially a decision that leaders in the community made, is that we have a very wide range of housing styles of housing that you can have in the city. You can start somebody who's just out of college can come and live in our community, and you can live all the way through your entire career in our community up to the several $1 million house in the city. We have the complete range of housing options. People never have to move away from our community. And not only that, but if you come to our community and you buy the starter home and your kids go in the public schools, you can have your kids stay basically in the same schools through their whole time period too. And that's an unusual thing in communities. There aren't a lot of communities in our area that can say that that's the case. And while I'm talking about schools, a really underappreciated, I think, even though people will talk about it, I think it really is a very important thing, is the fact that we have a quality school district. And I think there's a couple measures that show why we have a quality school district, or show that people believe that. One is that people vote for the referenda on a regular basis when the school district goes out and asks for more money. But I also think if you look at the numbers of people who come from outside the community to come to our schools, and if you look at the percentage of students that live in the community that end up going to the public schools, both of those show that families in Bloomington are very confident in their school. And where that comes into play is if people aren't confident in the schools in the community, people won't buy a house in the community. And you get in a negative cycle of home ownership, and then you kind of go in the wrong direction. And so one of the things that's been a big benefit of taking all of these factors together is that all of these things have served to make properties in Bloomington be more valuable than they would otherwise be if any of these factors was gone. If it was easier to drive farther to a newer house, if there were better schools that somebody else could go to, all of those factors would cause property values to be lower. And having good property values makes people want to invest in their property, which allows things to be kept up. So that cycle is a really important cycle that we have to maintain in the community, is the cycle of having all of these benefits to cause people to want to live in our community. So that's a bit on why I think the city is successful. And I want to differentiate two things here, and we often do this when we're on the city council, when Karen was on the city council, is we differentiate between the city as the community and the city as the organization. So we all think of the city as kind of a community, but when you're on the city council, there's an organization that you're running as well. And there's a couple factors that makes the city as an organization be successful that I want to point out, that are really valuable things, and they're things that are easily wasted away if we're not careful. Number one is that we have a stable set of leaders in the community where we're not constantly going back and forth on what we want to have, that we have a trajectory that the city is operating on. And we get all sorts of input, and that trajectory can move as time passes and different people are participating, but we don't have radical changes in that. And we don't have radical changes in the management of the city either. And that means that we can have a professional staff that comes to the city and that sticks around for the long run and sees it as a place that they can make a career at. And you can go and look at other communities in the metro area that have had turmoil at the top. And in fact, in Bloomington, we employ some of the people who are escapees from the turmoil at the top in other cities. I don't know if I see one in the room here. But what happens is that when there's turmoil at the top, people look at that and they say, is this really what I want to go to work and do every day? Do I want to go do that? And we've been lucky, and it's a combination of luck and it's a combination of people wanting it to be this way, that we haven't had turmoil at the top. Another thing that makes Bloomington a successful organization is that we're able to attract people because we have interesting problems for people to go work on. So if you're somebody who's involved in planning or in public works and you want to go work someplace where there's interesting problems, where you're going to have a complicated sort of thing, where you go tell your friends, this is what I'm working on, the city is a great place to do that because we do really interesting things at the city that you don't get the opportunity to do very often. And things like one-of-a-kind things like the lowering of Lindau Lane. Okay, where else are you spending, for that street extension and the lowering, tens of millions of dollars? It has all of these kind of special properties to it. You have huge volumes of traffic going through it. It's a site that attracts attention from an international basis. And so you have an opportunity to work on projects like that at the city. And it's really unusual at the municipal level to have the opportunity to do that in a suburban atmosphere. Another thing that tells us that we have a good operation at the city and that makes it be successful is that we have what I would call a surplus of leaders. And as council members, we looked carefully at succession planning in the city to make sure that we have a crop of leaders that were growing to take positions. And remember one time we had a conversation, because we had a couple leaders in our city leave to go to take similar positions in other cities. And it was like, well, it's too bad we're losing people like that, was what one person said to me. And my response was, actually, I think it's good that you're producing leaders like that you have extra leaders that can go and work in other places. Because what that tells you you're doing is you're doing a good job of developing people. I'd much rather be in the position of, we're doing a really good job of developing people, and we've got 2 candidates to take this important position over here. We can only pick one of them. The other one will go and do something else. I'd much rather be in that position than to be in the position of digging around in the empty larder to find a leader. And so I think it's a good thing when you see a leader leave from Bloomington and go and become a police chief in another city, or a public works director in another city, or a community development director in another city. That's a sign that the city's doing a good job. As long as it's not in a 6-month period that everybody leaves and goes and takes positions, then that's not a good thing. Finally, I think that the decision back in 1960 to adopt the city charter and to go to the council manager form of government is one of the keys to the stability of the city. The city council operates very much like a board of directors of a company. And we tend to focus pretty strongly on policy-related things at the council and let the operation of the city be run by the professional staff. And you can, when you're an insider and you go talk to people in other cities, you can tell the difference. And that was a key decision by the voters and the city leaders in the 1960 to bring the charter forward. So we've also, let's see here. So I want to talk a little bit about what I see as attributes of the community's culture. And I think that, you know, and we heard another talk today, I think it's a place where people have an opportunity to do great things, and there's lots of support for business in our community. And if you look at the number of businesses and number of jobs in the community, the facts are there that it's a great place to run a business. But we're also a community that's about responsibility and about community and working together. And if you look at our history, we have a long history of creating and sustaining what I would call non-governmental nonprofits that solve social problems in the city, as opposed to having government coming and doing that. And I made a list of a couple of them. Kind of the granddaddy in our community is BAA, the Athletic Association, and a huge organization that has thousands and thousands of kids every year involved in it. It takes an enormous amount of work to make go. We have VEEP and Cornerstone, which are important social service organizations that have been around for a while in the community. And we have a relatively new organization that's growing like weeds, which is Bridging in the community. So it's not just things that were created in the 1950s, in the kind of communitarian era of the 1950s that are kind of these long legacy things, but it's also possible for people to come forward with an idea today and say, this is an idea that I want to take forward, and create something from nothing into a great organization. So now what I want to do, I want to switch to talking about the future and a couple of challenges that I want to kind of talk about for this city. The first one is I've just been talking about Bloomington's culture. The question is how to the next generation of Bloomington residents do we infuse them with that same culture so that our city continues to be a place that people want to live in? And it's not necessarily about taking every single attribute of the culture that we created and imposing it on the next generation and saying that we want it exactly like it was before, but trying to figure out what are the essentials of what the Bloomington culture is like and bringing that forward to the next generation that's coming along. And just like in Minnesota, we had the Swedes and the Germans that were here, and then we had the immigrant generations that came after that in Minnesota. The same thing that's happening in Minnesota today, that we're seeing new generations of people come into the community. And one of the challenges that we have is making sure that people like that see their wants and needs reflected in what we're doing. And at the same time, we're clear about what it's meant in the past, what's the legacy of what Bloomington has been like, and making sure that they understand that so that the key parts of those values get brought forward to the future. So I'm just looking here to decide which of these I want to talk about next. Okay, another key challenge, and this is in my book is the key kind of growth challenge for the city going into the next probably 20, 30 years, is how to transition the 494 strip here from being primarily an auto-oriented facility to being something that has a combination of auto and transit along it. And the reason I'm talking about that is that it's becoming pretty clear that getting cars in and out of this area is getting harder and harder. And I'll give you an example of something that we talked about recently at the City Council. The people on the south side of the river, Burnsville and Apple Valley, came and said, hey, can we figure out how to get more cars to go across the Cedar Avenue Bridge? Because if you live in that area, getting cars across the Cedar Avenue Bridge, it's a real problem for them. That's part of the reason why house prices are higher here and lower there, because they have to wait in that line to get across the river. And the MnDOT engineers were all focused on all of these great ideas on how to get more cars to go across the bridge, because the MnDOT engineers were told, go figure out how to get more cars to go across the bridge. So we can change the stripes. They had if you've seen that machine that they had out here that moves the barrier around, they're like, we'll buy one of those and we'll make it so that there's a lane that we can switch during the day and have it go back and forth. They had all these ideas. And then as they got to the end of the process, they finally figured out that there's no place for the cars to go. That when the cars got to the north side of the river, it'd be like hooking a pipe up to Old Shakopee Road and pumping a bunch of cars into Old Shakopee Road, or just a giant pile of cars would pile up in front of 494. Because basically the dominant driving route that people take is they go up Cedar and they go west on 494. And who's been over at the mall like on Saturday afternoon and come out of the mall and you're going north on Cedar and you want to go west on 494 and there's a line on Saturday afternoon, okay? Well, that's Saturday afternoon. That's not rush hour in the morning. That's Saturday afternoon, okay? Rush hour in the morning, it's even worse in that area. And so the key thing, and I think it's also going to be a key driver of growth in this corridor, is figuring out how to get more people to and from work along 494 without using a car. Because if you look along here, there's not enough right-of-way to build 3 more lanes in each direction. There's not enough physical room. And if you look at the values for land, it's the reason why we were never able to do the 494 and 35W intersection that MnDOT first came up with, because of the hundreds of $1 million worth of office buildings and stuff that you'd have to tear down to do it. So the only way to get people in and out of there is by increasing the number of people per vehicle that's going along 494. And that's going to be the key to increasing kind of development in this corridor, is doing that. So that's number one. Is I think the 494 corridor, that's a very important thing to the future of our community. Now to kind of throw a wrinkle in that a little bit, I have a question about whether we can depend on office space as a driver of our future growth. So I just got done saying how if we're going to have more offices along here, we have to figure out how to get people in and out. But one question, I think it's a question that a lot of people are asking, is what's the future of work going to be like, and what's the future of offices going to be like?
Are you guys tying in anything with Minneapolis? Because you know that Minneapolis had an article the other day where they want 100,000 more people, but they don't want 100,000 more cars.
Yeah, so I think you'll have to you could ask Larry after the meeting what they're doing on that. But I think that what you're seeing here is that we're going to be in kind of this interesting kind of transitional state where Bloomington's never going to be a community which is like a downtown community or uptown in Minneapolis where you can go live there and never have a car. Okay, and that's not going to be the case in Bloomington. But what you're going to have in Bloomington is situations where if we're going to continue to be a presence in the metro area, there's got to be ways for people to get to and from work that don't involve driving a car, because we're just not going to have enough space to do it. And so that's what Minneapolis is facing, is how to get more people, because they want to get more people in the community. That's one of the reasons why, compared to other cities of the same age, Minneapolis is successful, is they've actually gotten people to move into Minneapolis, it's a good thing for our whole region to have that. But they're in a little bit different position than we are with regard to that. Okay, so I talked a little bit about bringing folks in. I talked a little bit about office space and 494. Another area where I think that we need to think about at the city is the city's workforce model. And so when I say the workforce model at the city is organized strongly around the idea that we're going to hire Diane Kirby right out of college. And Diane's going to come work at the city and out of her paycheck, and the city's going to put money in PERA. And after 30 years, Diane will be done working at the city, and Diane will retire, and Diane will get a pension from PERA. Okay? And what that means is that all of the rewards, not all the rewards, but a big part of the rewards for working at the city are backloaded in the idea that you're going to get paid less now, but you're going to have a pension when you're older. And that's a trade-off that I think breaks down on a couple different ways. For starters, I think it's hard for young people to explain the value of that when you're talking to people and hiring them. You have to go through, and they've been hiring managers, so you have to go through and very carefully explain how that works. And you have to get somebody who is farsighted enough to actually be willing to make that trade. There's a lot of people who aren't willing to make that trade. But the other thing that it does is having a model like that where the rewards are heavily backloaded reduces people's mobility in the workforce. Now, Bloomington is lucky because Bloomington is large enough that it's possible for people to make a career and move to different places inside the city organization and continue to accrue those long-term rewards. But it still is difficult to, if you have something where it makes sense to, you have to be making a long-term commitment to come and work at the city, and that doesn't match up with how the world works today with respect to workforce management. And so I think one thing that has to be looked at, and it's not something probably that's completely within the control of the city, because around workplace rules, the city's very regulated by the legislature. But one thing that has to happen is that we need to encourage more mobility so that people can match their skills up with the sort of work that needs to be done at that particular point in time. Another part of the workforce model that's a little bit broken is inside cities, you tend to have these wage grids where there are very prescribed jobs and things match up. And that model is also a model that has kind of broken down. How am I doing on time here? Got 3 minutes? Okay, a couple minutes, okay. So, so I guess to wrap up, I think that working on the city council over the last 15 years has really been an enjoyable experience. And when people ask me, would you like to do something else? I always tell them that I really think that the city council is the best job in politics that you can have. And the reason is the city council really works as a collaborative entity. You can stay in touch with individual people and respond to individual needs. And so I think it's an incredibly rewarding thing to be involved in. And if people are interested in that sort of thing, I think it's a great way to kind of be involved in politics without having to be involved in capital P politics. And so I really enjoyed my tenure on the city council. And yeah, so thanks for inviting me to come today and talk.
Thank you.
Do you have a couple minutes to start?